Howdy, y'all. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 44 today. We're going to be talking about geographic expansion. So the topic will include both Protestant and Catholic expansion throughout the world, but specifically into the Far East. And this was a long one, so we're going to break this one up into two parts. So we'll do part one this week, and then we'll finish it out next week. We start by looking at the missionary enterprise in the age of colonialism. In the Western world, the attitudes of Christians towards colonialism were widely divergent, even in the time in which this was going on. Some opposed particular colonizing ventures on the grounds that they were contrary to the national interest. Many Christians protested against the treatment of people in some colonized areas, so there were definitely some that didn't like it, even in the day and time in which colonialism was happening. But in general, the colonizers, including many devout Christians, were convinced that their enterprise was justified by the benefits the colonized people would receive. Now, that's easy to say when you're the ones doing the colonizing. Oh, don't worry about it. You're going to get more out of this than we are, or it's going to at least be, we'll both get stuff out of it. But did the people that were being colonized get any say in it? Because surely they would not have traded their own ability to rule themselves for whatever benefits the Western colonizers thought that they were going to get out of it. So it's true that they did get benefits, but it doesn't offset the fact that they were being taken over by force. As they saw matters, God had placed the benefits of Western civilization in their hands in order for them to share with the rest of the world. Again, okay, if God gave it to you to share, then why not just share it? Why do you have to go take somebody over? Just go show them how to do things, or give them the option, or help them out. Don't go and take their country over and then say, well, after all, you're getting a benefit out of this too. That's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous take, but they had it. That responsibility was the so-called white man's burden, to take to the rest of the world the benefits of industrialization, capitalism, democracy, and Christianity. Oh, wasn't it so nice of them to decide to go and enrich themselves and empower themselves by taking over other places, but they also got the burden of passing on these ideas too. There were grounds for such visions. Medical science reached many remote areas and saved countless lives. Trade and industrial development increased the wealth of many areas, and for that reason gained the support of certain classes among native populations. So there were beneficial things that happened. It's just that you could have passed on the stuff that was beneficial without actually having to go conquer a group or decide that you were going to be better set to rule them. So, yeah, do you want to look at some benefits that happen? Sure, there are. No doubt. There's technology. There's medical and scientific knowledge that these groups didn't have. But in the end, the ends justify the means is rarely the case, honestly. And it's not the case here. But modernity also produced the dislocation of vast masses who now became landless, the destruction of many of the cultural patterns that had sustained societies for centuries, and growing disparities in living conditions between the rich and the poor throughout the world. So we know that this is not the best time in history for people doing the right thing, and especially those who would have come with some kind of a idea in mind that they were actually being helpful. So not a great shining moment, but again, we don't ignore history. We have to learn from it. So these events are taking place at the same time that missionary work is going to be expanding through these areas. The entire enterprise produced the anti-colonial reaction that marked the middle of the 20th century. So it's setting up events that are going to be coming up after the 19th century and well into the middle of the 20th century. The church was deeply influenced by all these circumstances and ideas, but the relationship between colonialism and missions was very complex. When you look at Christianity and the mission work, many of these missionaries did not like the colonialism. And even though maybe they got into the country as a result of it, they weren't supportive of it necessarily. So it definitely is a complex relationship, and one that you can't just dismiss one way or the other as being all good or all bad. There's a lot to it. There's many facets. Although many saw missionaries as agents of colonialism, this was not always true. There were missionaries who opposed it, and many criticized and condemned various aspects of it. So if any group was actually standing up and saying there's a problem with this, it tended to be the missionaries who got on the ground with the people in these countries, and they saw the results of what was happening. And not all of them, obviously. There were some that went right along with it. But there were definitely missionaries who stood up and said, hey, this isn't right. And we could be going about this a better way. And it shouldn't be happening as far as gaining power and money and whatever else off the backs of these people shouldn't be happening. And so to their credit, many of them did stand up against that. It was also not true that missionaries always entered through a door opened by colonialism. It's looked at as kind of, well, yeah, maybe some missionaries said that they didn't really like everything, but they still took advantage of it. And it's not always the case. Many missionaries reached regions that had never been visited by white traders or colonizers. So the missionaries were going deeper in than many of these colonizers to try to reach people. And so they were going well past where they got a benefit, although maybe they did get their foot in the door as a result of it. Many colonial authorities and commercial interests opposed missionary work because they feared that religious conflict would interrupt trade. So again, here's this group of people, Westerners, supposed to be Christians. They are supporting business interests, and they put that ahead of being able to spread Christianity in the world because they think it might hurt the bottom line. So you just see a lot of, again, selfishness and greed and not living out the principles and the teachings of Jesus Christ in the actions that are taking place by the rich and the powerful at this time. There's not really any good way to spin it. It was definitely the case. And the only time they really did want to help missionaries, at least, I shouldn't say all of them, but at least a lot of them, was if it would benefit them directly. And otherwise, they could take them or leave them or actually oppose them. It is true that the colonial expansion of the West coincided with its missionary expansion, so that the two at times aided and at times impeded each other. So it was going on at the same time. It wasn't happening in a vacuum, and sometimes they helped each other out, and sometimes they didn't help each other out. Both things were happening. That brings us to the topic of missionary societies. One of the most remarkable characteristics of the missionary enterprise during the 19th century was the formation of missionary societies. Forerunners of the movement were the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, and that's the latter part of the 17th century and very early part of the 18th century. Both were Anglican, and for some time most of their work was among British expatriates. Due to the impact of Pietists, Moravians, and Methodists, several similar societies were founded during the 18th century. So these groups were going on towards the end of the 17th and into the 18th century as well, but they don't really blow up then. But the heyday of missionary societies began late in the 18th century and lasted through the 19th. So that latter part of the 18th century into the 19th century is when we see these societies really start to make an impact. In 1792, the Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel Among the Heathen was founded. It was eventually shortened to Baptist Missionary Society. That was a good call on shortening that because that's a lot to say. 3 years later, a group of Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists founded the London Missionary Society. The Church Missionary Society, which was founded in 1799, drew its members from the evangelical wing of the Anglican Church. So these groups are starting to pop up, and they're going to have a lot of impact on the times in which they existed. Other societies were also created with more specific goals, such as the British and Foreign Bible Society, founded in 1804. The movement then spread to other lands, and soon there were Protestant missionary societies in the Netherlands, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, and several other countries. So these societies are popping up all over Western Europe. In France, there were both Protestant and Catholic societies. Congregationalists in the United States founded the American Band of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. So all through the Western world, these groups are popping up. When one of its missionaries, Adoniram Judson, became a Baptist missionary society was organized to support him and others, and this society eventually gave birth to the American Baptist Convention. We'll get back to Adoniram later on in this presentation, but kind of keep that name in your mind because you'll be hearing about him again. Continuing on, the emergence of these societies points to another characteristic of the missionary movement of the 19th century, its widespread support. For the centuries before, most missionary work took place with the official support of the state. By the time of the 19th century, most Western governments had little or no relationship with missionary enterprises. So we're moving into the time in history where finally the state is taking its hands out of the inner workings of the church, and the church is then starting to recede from the state. It hasn't completely yet, but we're getting into that separation of church and state time. And so things will have to change. The founding and the funding of these missionaries are no longer going to be a government issue, and they're not even going to necessarily be a church denomination issue. They're going to have be sent and be supported in a different way, and that's where these missionary societies come into play. In fact, the British East India Company tried to bar missionaries from the lands under its rule. Meanwhile, most European governments in the United States had a neutral or even slightly hostile stance toward missionaries. So they're not getting a lot of help from the powers that be. They're going to have to make their way on their own or get help somewhere else, which they do. Because few governments and few churches supported missionaries financially, those interested in missions had to appeal to the public at large. As a result, for the first time in centuries, the general membership of churches was captivated by the work of missionaries. So this was kind of going on behind the scenes and orchestrated by state powers and also the upper echelons of church organization or church denominations, or the Catholic Church actually. And most people weren't really aware of what was happening. They didn't have any direct involvement in it and didn't really know anything that was going on. That's all changed now because they are going to become directly involved through financial support. And they're going to want to know what's going on as a result of that. And they're going to learn a lot for the first time in a long time about missionary work. Those who wished to do so were offered the opportunity to make a direct contribution to missions in distant and exotic lands. The societies brought news of what was taking place in the remotest areas of Asia or Africa, and thus became one of the main sources of public information and education regarding these other lands and cultures. Obviously, these people lived in a time where you couldn't just go get on the internet and Google search what's going on in Asia right now, or, how's Africa looking? You couldn't do that. Even resources that would be up to date were hard to come by. So this was a way of learning about these places that existed in the world, but that most people in the Western world knew very little about. And so they were very interested in it. It was a great source of education for them, and for them to have some kind of relationship with a different part of the world. At least they had something to do with it by supporting the missionaries, hearing about their work, praying for the people involved. So it actually was a positive thing for common people to be involved in these societies, and they ended up, of course, helping the missionaries to get out and spread the gospel. So it's a good relationship that was forming. Women played an important role in all this. In many denominations, women organized their own missionary societies. These groups collected funds and supplies for work overseas. So this was something that women really got involved in, and it gave them an outlet to be in leadership and support. And so we're going to see this even more when women start to actually step onto the mission field. But even before that time, they're going to be very involved in helping collect funds and organizing. And so this is an outlet for them to actually get some responsibility, which was hard to come by at that time, but they were able to get it with this. Looking further into this missionary movement, at first, missionaries were all men, although some brought along their wives, but soon women began to enter the mission field overseas. Some female missionary societies began sending their own missionaries at this time, and of course that would have been females. So women are going to be able to get on the field and actually have individual responsibility as missionaries. And again, this is not something that was easy for them to come by in life in general. So to get to do this was a great thing. And it was a big step forward. Now, you may be wondering, why did they get the opportunity to do this? If they weren't able to do it at home, why could they do it out on the field? Well, we'll get to that in just a second here. Female missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, were involved in teaching, nursing, caring for the aged, etc. Female Protestant missionaries found that they were allowed to do things on the mission field that they were forbidden to do at home, such as preaching and organizing churches. So the question is, why? They weren't allowed to do that at home because the understanding for most churches was that women were not allowed to teach men. They weren't allowed to be pastors. They weren't allowed to take those roles. And they certainly weren't allowed to be the main person in charge of organizing churches. So why on the mission field were they able to do it? They were going to be dealing with men there too. Well, here's where the sexism meets racism and actually gives a good, I guess, a positive step forward, but not meaning to. So the thinking was that these people in foreign countries, because of racial views at the time that were not correct, that they were lesser. And so they didn't put it in the same category as, like, you teaching a white man in our country. You go teach a man in Africa or India, they're a lesser person, so they're not on the same level, so you can teach them. So it's very bad thinking, but it led to women being able to do some things they couldn't do at home. And it's kind of like a double negative. They cancel each other out. And in this sense, you got two bad things. You got women not being given enough responsibility. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there wasn't some validity to the teachings of different roles for men and women in Scripture, because I think they are there, but they were way too restrictive. And certainly in this case, they weren't allowed to do almost anything. But you can go out now and do it on the mission field because these people are lesser than you. That's another bad thinking too, right there, sexism and racism. But they combined to create a positive situation for these women. So sometimes things just work out that way. They're not good. It's not good, but something good came out of it. And that's kind of what happened here. Another important consequence of the missionary movement was the spirit of cooperation that began to appear between various denominations. Here's another positive. Rivalries that were accepted in Europe or the United States were a stumbling block to missionary work in India or China. Therefore, many missionaries took steps to lower the barriers between denominations. This effort was taken up by their converts as well. So when you go into a country where you're the enemy or you're being resisted, all of a sudden those little squabbles don't mean a whole lot. You're trying to work together to survive and to be able to establish something. And if you're going to fight about minor doctrinal issues, you're not going to make it. You're going to be dead meat. And they realize that. And that all of a sudden, those things just kind of weren't that important. They're trying to spread the gospel into a place that doesn't want to hear it. And they're having to overcome some huge obstacles to do it. So that brings these barriers down. And then in turn, you brought your ideas to this new country, but because you're having to cooperate, they're not seeing the division that would be true in Europe or in the United States. They're only seeing people that, although they don't agree on every single idea, they still work together. And so they're able to see a better example of how Christians should behave than what they would have seen if they were actually in Europe or the United States. And so that's the way they're going to do things, because that's the example that was set. And so you get a very positive experience for the fact that there was some hardship to overcome. Some missionary societies drew their members from more than one denomination. So although many of them were tied into denominations, not all of them were. And in fact, there were several that would support different missionaries, and the denomination really didn't matter. So that was, again, another working together and not being divided, but trying to be on the same side. In the mission field, ways were constantly sought to present a common witness and avoid competition. So they really put a lot of effort into that. Thus, the ecumenical movement, at least among Protestants, has one of its main roots in the missionary experience of the 19th and 20th century. So those having to get along on the mission field helped to solve some of the problems that existed between different groups, and then they were able to take that home with them and encourage those back at home to work together, and it kind of helped with this ecumenical movement that's coming. So again, a bunch of positive stuff that's going to come from this missionary movement during the 19th century. So So let's look now into some specific areas and what was going on, and we'll start by looking at the Far East and Asia. For centuries, the ancient civilizations of the Far East had fascinated Europeans. Marco Polo and other travelers brought news of fabulous riches in the courts of China and India, and of course that perked up the ears of those who heard about it, and they wanted to get in on some of those riches. So they start coming over and establishing trade routes, but eventually that's not even enough. They're going to come over and see if they can't get directly involved. By the time of World War I, there were few countries in Asia and the Pacific that were not under colonial rule. So these European nations came on in and they took over, and there were very few countries at the time of World War I, so early in the 1900s, that were not under colonial rule. There's very few. Mostly they were. So they had definitely come in and taken a big chunk of the area. Although not always in agreement with colonial policies, missionaries and the churches they founded played a role in the process of European expansion. They would have to, because they're over there as Westerners, they're expanding, the culture is going to expand with it, and obviously Christianity from a Western perspective is going to expand with it. So they're a part of it whether they wanted to be or not. In Asia, the new wave of colonial expansion first impacted the Indian subcontinent and modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Christianity had existed in these areas from ancient times, and Catholicism had been there since the 16th century. So if you go back to the first season of our study, and even those first couple of episodes, you'll see that Christianity expanded into India very early on. And so they're not coming into an area that had no background in Christianity, but they are coming into an area that there hadn't been too many people from the outside come in with Christian ideas since then. Now, in the 16th century, Catholicism had come in, but that's still it's still fairly recent for this time. But they're going to expand big time now. They're going to really expand now. Early in the 18th century, Protestant missionaries first arrived, sent by a Danish king profoundly affected by pietism. But it was in the 19th century that the greatest Protestant missionary advance took place. By the 19th century, the British East India Company ruled almost the entire eastern coast of the subcontinent of India. So you've got British rule going on here. By the middle of the 19th century, almost the entire area was under British rule. In 1858, the government of India, then in the hands of the East India Company, was seized by the British government and placed directly under British rule. So this area is going to be very, very heavily ruled by the British, but as we'll see, it's not 100% ruled by the British, but it is very much ruled by the British at this time. So let's look at what was going on in India. During its first century in operation, the British East India Company opposed missionary work because it feared that Christian preaching would cause tension and rioting. They couldn't have that. It was partly as a result of the efforts of William Carey that these conditions changed, and therefore he has been called the founder of modern missions. Although brought up Anglican, William Carey became a Baptist. Carey was a teacher and cobbler by trade. He became fascinated by the news of new lands that Captain Cook was discovering in the Pacific. So he had heard about these places like many Westerners had, and he was very interested in learning more about them and perhaps even visiting them. Through his faith, he came to the conviction that Christians had the obligation to preach the gospel in distant countries to people who had never heard it. So his heart began to be moved for these people that he knew had largely not heard the gospel. And so his fascination with the area became a desire, a passion to spread the gospel to that area. After enduring much criticism, he was able to gather a group of like-minded people and form the Particular Baptist Society for propagating the gospel among the heathen. So another mouthful of an organization's name, but they're going to make a big push, and they're going to lay the foundation for many, many groups to come. When the society was unable to find anyone to send as a missionary, Carey decided to go himself. So he wasn't originally going to be the missionary. He's kind of more of the organizer, but then, it's kind of one of those deals where nobody else is going to volunteer. I'm going to have to be the one to lead by example, and he did. In 1793, he landed in Calcutta with his family and a physician to help him in his labors. Though his difficulties were many, his zeal and his reports to England resulted in new interest in missions. He was eventually joined by a second group of missionaries. So he sent back reports. He stayed positive. He wanted to push forward, and it got people excited. And so more people were going to come join him. Carey and his associates, one of whom was a printer, felt that one of their first tasks should be to make the Bible available to the Indian population. By the time of his death, Carey had translated the Bible in whole or in part into 35 languages. Now, there's some good and some bad with this. First of all, the good is that he made the effort. I mean, a man later in life, even as an adult of any age, to be able to learn some part of 35 languages is impressive. However, he didn't, I mean, as you can imagine, he didn't learn real well. Anybody would have a hard time learning 35 languages no matter how old you are. But to be able to do that and to very competently translate into those languages, I mean, it's a near impossible task. So those translations are not good. They were later, it was later revealed how bad they really were in some ways. And so you look at it and think, well, that's rough to give a poor translation. But then you have to look and say, but at least he tried. He did what he could. And he was the one who who kind of laid the groundwork for this eventually getting done the right way or better. He put his effort out there. Nobody else was going to do it. So you have to give him credit for it, but you also have to admit that, well, those translations weren't the best. He also devoted his efforts to putting an end to the custom of burning widows on their husbands' funeral pyres. You may have heard about this in history, but it actually happened in that part of the world. A husband would die. The thought was, well, the wife there's no life for her without her husband, so just throw her on the pile too. And they didn't even give her the option of, at least let me die a nonviolent death and throw me on there. No, they burn them alive. It's awful. It's awful to think about. And obviously, when these missionaries came in, and Carey especially, because he was one of the first, and realized what was going on, they wanted to put a stop to it. And he did a lot to help with that. So a positive thing, and definitely a great figure when it comes to looking at missionaries and a passion and a desire to spread the gospel around the world. And that's through William Carey. Looking further at things in India, reports of Carey's work inspired many to emulate him. Many missionary societies founded early in the 19th century owed their existence to his influence. So he's going to definitely blaze the trail forward. Increasing numbers of Christians felt called to similar careers. So as more people went, as more reports were sent back, as more passionate zeal was realized, it attracted people to go. And they did. In 1813, when the charter of the British East India Company came up for renewal, Parliament included a clause granting missionaries free access to areas under company control. So now the government's going to jump in again. They're going to try to help the church out. They're going to try to help the missionaries out. We're going to see this even more so in China, that these efforts to try to help out missionaries are actually going to backfire. They didn't necessarily backfire in India so much, but they were... you start getting involved in other people's lives from outside and force them to do things, not things being done in a manner where the people have a say in it, but you were making them do it. That's, people are going to resent that, and it puts the missionary in a bad position. So you look at that and think it's positive. It's not necessarily always that positive, but they did at least realize that missionary work needed to happen, and they wanted to help it. So their heart's in the right place, but maybe not necessarily doing the best things. Again, maybe not so much in India is it so bad, but China's going to get real bad. In India itself, Carey's work did not at first bring many converts, but by the end of his career, a firm foundation for a church had been established. In the next generation, the Scotsman Alexander Duff became famous for his work in education. He was convinced that the best way for Christianity to enter India was through education. As a result of his work and that of others, by the time India gained its independence a century later, many of the leaders of the new nation were either Christian or people profoundly influenced by the Christian faith. So these men, they really made a huge impact in India during this time. Meanwhile, there were mass conversions among the lower classes. This was aided by the fact that Protestant missionaries in India refused to accept the caste system. This attracted people and tribes who had been termed untouchable. So the outcasts of society are attracted to Christianity. That's the theme of every country it's ever entered. It's going to attract first the outcasts and the poor, the people that have been disparaged, the people that have been looked at as the scum of the earth or that are lesser than others. They're going to be attracted to it because the gospel, the true gospel, accepts everyone. There's not going to be a qualification. You read, Paul says, in Christ, there's no male or female. There's no Greek or Jew. Those qualifications don't matter. The rich or the poor, we're all one. We're all members of the same body. And a poor person could gain some responsibility in the church, could be listened to, and also have the hope of the future. My world and my life now is not good, but there's a better world coming. And that's a great message for those who have been downtrodden. And so we see this anywhere the gospel has gone into a country for the first time, or maybe for the first time in a long time, is with India here. You're going to see that group respond first. It's routine. And it definitely happened here because this was a message of hope for them in a world that was hopeless. Likewise, many women found freedom in Christianity and responded by assuming positions of responsibility. Among them was Pandita Ramabai, who devoted her life to the education of women. As a result, many women were able to make significant contributions to the church in Indian society. So a great many women were able to make an impact. A great many women in India were attracted to Christianity because of what promise it held for them, and they'd made a huge difference in that country. Now let's look at Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, zones of colonial influence were separated by the Kingdom of Siam, which is in modern-day Thailand. East of it, French colonials appeared while the British took charge of Burma, which is modern-day Myanmar, west of Siam, so they're on the west part. In the French area, Catholic missionaries organized converts into separate villages where they could live according to Catholic teachings. So they kind of separated them, and for a long time, there would be a Buddhist village and a Christian village. They wouldn't intermix. And it was many, many years until that went away. In Burma, the most famous missionary was Adoniram Judson. I told you we'd get back to him, an American Congregationalist who became a Baptist on the way to the mission field. He and his wife translated scripture into Burmese, Thai, and other languages. In Siam, the only land of Southeast Asia to preserve its independence, there were both Catholic and Protestant missionaries. By the end of the century, they had succeeded in founding fairly strong countries. So interestingly, the nation that was most independent, also the missionaries were able to do a lot of great work there, and it lasted. But China remained the great empire of the Far East. Christianity had been introduced repeatedly, and repeatedly it had been quashed by means of severe persecution and isolation. Westerners in general, but also the missionaries, definitely wanted to get in there. Late in the 16th century and early in the 17th, a small Catholic church had been founded, but by the beginning of the 19th century, the small Catholic community in China was leading a precarious existence. Protestants dreamed of entering China. They began the monumental task of translating the Bible and other books into Chinese. So that was smart, trying to kind of get ahead of things and already have it translated when you got there, or were in the process of getting there. The great difficulty was that the Chinese government did not want foreigners within its borders. Only a small number of Westerners were allowed in certain restricted areas, so it's going to be a challenge for them to get in, and the ways they ended up getting in were not necessarily the best. So we'll look more at China now. Then the Opium War broke out. This shameful episode involved the British going to war against China in defense of the alleged right of British merchants to import opium into China. This was in direct violation of Chinese law. So they went to war against a country because they couldn't bring drugs into the country and sell them because it violated the law of that country. Just really crazy thinking. But the British didn't care because they knew they had the forces to overcome China, and they were going to win, and they did. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanjing, which granted the British the island of Hong Kong and opened 5 Chinese ports important to British trade. So they win that one. They get Hong Kong and some other concessions. After these events, other powers followed the British in using military might to force concessions from China. Many of the treaties Forcing these concessions included the agreement that missionaries be allowed into China. You know, when you look at world history, you see things only from the perspective of yourself and the time in which you live. And you look at it and you think, well, why the Chinese and people in that part of the world don't like Westerners so much? Why they say such things about us? Well, if you look back at some of this history, you can understand why. Westerners came in and did terrible things to them. That doesn't just go away. Now, the people that it happened to maybe don't live, they're not alive anymore. They definitely weren't from this time, but the history's still there and the effects of those things are still there. And so the chickens come home to roost eventually. Anytime this stuff happens, you have to deal with it. You have to deal with the consequences of it. You don't just get to go off scot-free. The Word of God says, be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that shall he reap. And when you do things the wrong way, you're going to reap bad stuff. And we see that here once again. Soon missionaries from various countries and denominations arrived in China. They had very encouraging early success, although some of that was as a result of a number of special provisions given to Chinese Christians by the government of China. So these were negotiated by these Western powers that the Chinese would incentivize people coming into Christianity because they would get extra food, they'd get extra privileges. And so, unfortunately, that brought a lot of people into Christianity that they weren't in it for the right reason. They didn't understand it. They weren't coming to faith in Christ because of a life change. They were coming because they get more rights, or they get more privileges, or they get more of the things they needed in life. And that's not the way to do things. It's not the way to do things, but they did. And so you had a bunch of people coming into Christianity, but it really wasn't in their heart to do it. They were doing it for other reasons. And you can't blame them because they were living terrible lives. And yeah, you're going to take it if you can get it. What do you need me to say? Okay, I'll say that. You can understand that. One unexpected byproduct of Christian preaching was the rebellion of Taiping, the heavenly kingdom. The movement was begun by Hong Shukwa, a school teacher who read a number of Christian treatises and decided the time had come to establish the heavenly kingdom of the great peace, over which he would reign. Now, Hong, if you're out there somewhere, I know I did not pronounce your name right, that last name. I went all through the internet looking at how to pronounce that, and for every one I heard, I probably heard another one. Nobody did it the same. So I did the best I could with it. If anybody knows how to pronounce it correctly, forgive me. I did put effort into trying to get it right, but we'll call him Hong and know that God knows, he knows his name, even if I don't know how to pronounce it right. In the kingdom, all things would be held in common. There would be equality between the sexes, and there would be laws against prostitution, adultery, slavery, binding of girls' feet, opium, tobacco, and alcohol. In 1850, this movement led to open rebellion. At first, the troops of the heavenly kingdom won several important battles. In 1853, they established the heavenly kingdom in Nanjing. But finally, with the help of the Western powers, the imperial armies crushed the rebellion. It had lasted 15 years and resulted in 20 million deaths. So a definite impact in this country due to Western expansion and probably a misunderstanding of the tenets of Christianity that led to a rebellion where a lot of people died. And it's unfortunate, but that's the kind of things that happen when you throw your weight around and push yourself in. So to wrap up today, let's look at this guy, J. Hudson Taylor. It was during the Taiping Rebellion that J. Hudson Taylor entered China. Ill health forced him to return to England, where he established the China Inland Mission, under which he returned to China. So he had to go back home, but then he came back. The purpose of this organization was to evangelize China without introducing the divisions that existed in European and American Protestantism. So a worthy goal there. It accepted missionaries from all denominations and resulted in hundreds of churches in various areas of the country. So they definitely did a positive work in China. But again, you have to question, why are the people coming? Is always for the right reason? Well, maybe not necessarily. Taylor refused to make use of the advantages to be obtained by foreign protection because he felt that the use of such privileges would create resentment among the Chinese. And that was definitely what was happening. There's a lot of resentment being built up among the Chinese because all these Western people are coming in and they're entering the country and being treated way better than the people that actually live there. And when you see that your whole life, you're not going to sit well with you. And that's definitely, we're going to see that happening here. And it's going to set things up again for the future of China, how it's going to develop, and the feelings they have about the Western world, which, knowing the stuff that you learn in history, at least you can understand why they came to those positions. Taylor was right. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901 was the violent expression of Chinese resentment of foreign intervention. It is estimated that well over 30,000 Chinese Christians were killed. The foreign diplomats in Beijing remained under siege until an army of combined Western forces came to their rescue. Eventually, the Western powers crushed the rebellion and obtained even greater concessions, including a huge payment. So it looks like they won, but ultimately they lose. Many missionary agencies refused to accept any payments. Eventually, all these upheavals led to the fall of the empire. In 1911, another rebellion broke out, and the way was cleared for the creation of the Republic of the United Chinese Provinces. By then, Protestant missionaries numbered in the thousands, and churches were flourishing. The future seemed so bright that there was talk of the conversion of the entire nation, similar to what had taken place in the Roman Empire during Constantine's reign. So that's a funny thing to think about now. We know what happened in China. It wasn't anything like what happened in the Roman Empire during Constantine's reign. In fact, it's going to be the opposite. And the seeds for the destruction of the Christian church and Western thinking in China have been sown by the Westerners themselves. And we'll get back into China later on. Next week, we'll start looking at some of the other nations in the area, starting with Japan, and we'll finish out this topic next week. But until then, thanks for taking time with me today. Hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and hope that you have a great rest of your week, and looking forward to being with you again next week. In the meantime, God bless.